welcome to the Knitting Skills Proficiency tutorial. Today we're going to talk about knitting in the round, but specifically on two circular needles. There are multiple ways of knitting in the round with double-pointed needles, with magic loop, but we're going to talk today about knitting in the round with two circular needles. Specifically, I'm going to teach you how to, first of all, switch from one circular needle to two. So for instance, if you're knitting a cap or something that decreases in size, and you can fit all your stitches on one circular cable needle, but then as you start to decrease at the top of the crown, you need to go down to a size, and that's the example I'm going to use. But you can also use it with sleeves that are decreasing, or just use two circular needles for things like socks or mittens or gloves, which are done in the round. So let's go right to it. So as I mentioned, today we're going to talk a little bit about switching over to two circular needles to knit in the round, especially when the number of stitches is too few to fit on your smallest of cable needles. So when I'm making one of my standard in the round caps, I can actually fit all my stitches onto one circular cable needle until I start getting up into the decrease section, where I have to switch over either to double points, magic loop, or two circular needles to be able to do it. So on this particular one, I've gotten to the place where I've just started to do the decreases at the top of the hat. And you can see as you look at the stitches are somewhat stretched out over the cable. So it's just barely, I'm just barely able to do it. And the next round of decreases would make it even tighter, obviously, along that. And so there's two ways I'm going to show you how to work in the round. And then I'm also going to give you a technique on how you can make best use of an interchangeable set of needles when you're knitting with two circulars in the round. So first of all, we'll start off with, I'm going to switch to a completely different needle. Now this assumes that you have two circular cable needles in the same size. In this particular case, I'm using US 10s or 6mm needles. And I happen to have a US 10 6mm needle in aluminum circular cable. So in order to switch, this is the beginning of my round. This happens to be a decrease round where I'm decreasing every, I'm knitting 5 and then knitting 2 together. So basically what I do is on approximately half the stitches, I just start knitting on the new needle. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then knit 2 together. And I'm going to do that for approximately half the stitches, but in my repeats. So in multiples of my repeats. So I'm going to do 4 repeats of knit 5 and knit 2 together. And as I'm doing this, you'll see that it's starting to get very tight on this needle. All you need to do is pull the tail end of the old needle through, and it loosens that up. So I've done 2 repeats so far together. And again, as this starts getting tight, all you have to do is pull on the tail end of your old needle, in this case, my interchangeable wood needle, and it loosens it up. So now I have approximately half my stitches on the old needle, and I've started knitting the first half of the stitches onto my new needle. And so it's approximately balanced. It doesn't need to be exact. In fact, it should be in a place where you know you're going to be making your decreases. So for instance, since I know that my decreases are always going to be at the end of this first needle, I always want to make sure, that's why I put it in multiples of my decrease rhythm, if that makes sense. So now you can see with the 2 circular needles, and I can pull these cables through a little bit so you can see it a little bit better, hopefully. You'll see that it creates this ability to get ever smaller, just like it would on a set of double pointed needles. But this, you only need to have 2 circular needles to do it. And the only trick you need to know is that you always work with the leading edge. I call this the leading edge of the needle, with the tail end of the same needle. So I'm sorry, this is the leading edge of the needle and this is the tail end. And so I'm always knitting using the same needle points. So I pick up the other needle to start. Since I have two separate needles, it makes it pretty easy to determine the difference between these two. And so I can continue to do my standard decrease of knit 5 and knit together on the original needle. And so to be able to knit on two circular needles, you can see that you just keep going from the lead edge of your one needle to the tail end of your other needle, and also with this one. Just one little trick as you're doing this is, as you start to knit onto the, in this case, the aluminum needle. So this is just going to be a plain knit round. So I'm just going to knit plain 3, 4. After I've knit 4 or 5 stitches using the aluminum needle, now I can actually pull this needle, the old needle, through a little bit and just let it cradle in the, I can pull it through the stitches so that it doesn't cause any kind of loose opening at the joint between those two needles. But I can also just let it rest in the crook of my thumb as I'm knitting across. It doesn't get in my way as I'm knitting these. And it also reminds me that when I get to the end of this needle, that this is the edge of the needle that I'm going to start with and knit with on the other side. So that's a trick I use to always make sure that I'm knitting with the same start and end, or lead and tail end of the needle when I'm knitting in the round with two circular needles. Now, the other trick I like to teach you is, what if you don't have two circular cable needles in the same size? So in order to describe, but you have an interchangeable set, let's say. So this is where I want to make a small distinction for you. When you're talking two circular cable needles, and we were discussing that you always knit from the lead needle off the trailing needle and off the same two tips of the needles. One of the things that you can do is use your interchangeable set. So in this case, like I said, I'm using US 10s or 6mm needles to make this hat. And you'll see that if I go to try to make a second circular set, my US 10s are gone because I'm using them both. However, if you switch the tail end of, that's the tail end, yes, the tail end to one size smaller needle in your interchangeables, it won't affect your gauge at all. So I'm going to take off the US 10 off of this side and take a second cable for my interchangeables and put it on there instead. And by the way, I don't know if you noticed, but the tool I'm using to tighten my interchangeables is actually a SIM card changer. So if you get a lot of cell phones and you've upgraded your cell phones, oftentimes they send along with a new cell phone this little tool to help you remove your SIM card from the old phone and put it into the new phone. I find they make great little tools to hold around to tighten my circular needles in case you have a similar type of thing. And then I'm going to use a size 9 tip on the trailing end of my needle. And I know it's one size shorter, but I'll show you how that works when you're working with two circulars from the same interchangeable set. So now I take my other circular cable from my interchangeable set and I put the US 9 or 5.5mm tip onto the what will be the trailing end of the second circular cable needle. And I'll tighten that up. using my handy dandy SIM card changer tool. Okay, so now since we already have the aluminum needle in there, I'm going to have to get to the place where I'm starting on the aluminum needle. So I'm taking the lead edge of my circular needle, and the trail end now has a US 9 attached to it, but that doesn't affect the gauge. We've already established a gauge with the leading edge part of the circular cable needle. So by knitting with the circular cable needle, and you're always knitting with it, and this is a decrease row, so it's 4 stitches and then decrease. And I pull the other needle through, but instead of using the aluminum needle, I'm going to use this new hybrid circular cable needle that I made with my interchangeable. Now I have to check carefully because this is the tail end. It's the US 9 side of the needle, and I have to make sure that I'm using the US 10 or the 6mm portion of the needle as the lead edge. So I make sure I knit with the US 10 size of it. And I just knit off those four, knit 2 together. Knit 1, 2, 3, 4, knit 2 together. And again, I can pull this out, pull out the tail end, which happens to be a US 9 tip, and just let it relax in the crook of my thumb right there, so that it kind of like reminds me that that's the one I'm going to use when I come to that needle next. And now I can get rid of the aluminum needle. Now, some might say that when you're knitting with 2 circular needles, it's a little bit easier to remember that you're always working with the aluminum needle or you're always working with the wood needle in my particular case. However, if you don't have the luxury of having multiple US size 10 needles, for instance, to do a hat, you can use your interchangeable needles to be able to create these hybrids where you've got a US 10 on the leading edge and a US 9 on the tail edge. And it works out pretty well. It doesn't change the gauge at all. So those are my 2 tips associated with knitting in the round. Just to recap, always make sure you're knitting from the front and back of the same cable needle when you're knitting on 2 circular needles. And also, if you have an interchangeable needle or an interchangeable set of needles, you can create a hybrid where the needle that you're knitting with is actually the size that you want, and the needle that you're knitting off of is one size less. I don't want to affect your gauge at all, and you can still leverage having an interchangeable set. So hopefully you enjoyed this. If you have any questions or clarifications that you need on this, please feel free to leave a comment down below. I always answer comments or questions when people ask them. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.